Hello, and welcome to another episode of Balanced Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Sam Apple is the faculty program coordinator of the MA in Science Writing program at Johns Hopkins University. Prior to his arrival at Johns Hopkins, Apple taught creative writing and journalism at the University of Pennsylvania for 10 years. He holds bachelor's degrees in English and creative writing from the University of Michigan and master's degree in arts and creative nonfiction from Columbia University. Apple is the author of several books, including American Parent and Schlepping Through the Alps, which was a finalist for the PEN America Award for a first work of nonfiction. He has published short stories, personal essays, satires, and journalistic features on a wide range of topics. In recent years, he has primarily written about science and health, including the book we'll be discussing today, Ravenous, Otto Warburg, the Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Wired, Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times Magazine, and ESPN The Magazine, among many other publications. Sam, what an honor it is to welcome you to Balanced Body Radio.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I have to admit that I have not yet read the book Ravenous. I know it's quite the read, but I was so fascinated by this story and hearing you tell it on some of my favorite platforms. We just had to reach out and have you tell us the story that you encountered and what it has to do with diet and nutrition. And I mean, it's just an incredible story. You recently gave an interview on my favorite podcast, Peter Attia's The Drive podcast, which I absolutely love and I recommend to everybody. And so obviously we won't be able to get into the depth that he would be able to access with you, but I'm super excited to talk to you about this.
Yeah, I'm excited as well. I love the Drive podcast as well, so I was thrilled to be able to be on it.
Yeah, that's great. I have to ask, were you a little bit intimidated to be on the Drive?
I was. It's a very serious operation, and they sent me like a microphone and a camera in advance. I was a little nervous getting ready for it.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, you did such a great job. You were a really great guest. He's such a great host too. He asks the most interesting questions, and it really gives his guests the time and space to answer them correctly. Well, that's awesome. I'm so glad you had that opportunity. So tell us a little bit about your background. I know you've done a lot of writing, but to kind of set the stage, we need to know a little bit about who you are and how you ended up finding this story.
Sure. So I spent my career as a writer and journalist, but the first part of my career, I was doing more general interest journalism, even some humor writing, some features for ESPN The Magazine, as you mentioned. But about a decade ago, I started to become more and more interested in metabolism and nutrition for a variety of reasons, in part because, I was concerned about my own health, and I'd reached my early 30s and noticed I was no longer in good shape and, concerns about chronic conditions in the family. And then, also influenced by some writers, Gary Taubes, first and foremost, who, I'm sure you're familiar with, has written a lot about low carb nutrition and health and disease.
Yeah, he's incredible.
So I became more and more interested through my reading. And, as a freelancer, one of the joys of being a freelance journalist is that you can really follow your own interests, become an expert on a topic, not a true expert, but, read about it, gain some knowledge, and then, speak to some people. And, after a little while, you pitch a piece. And once, I wasn't really a science journalist, but once you do one piece, then you have some credibility and you start pitching more. So over the years, I slowly sort of turned myself into a science journalist. And now I'm, working at the Johns Hopkins science journalism program. So it's been a somewhat gradual evolution. But, I think what drew me to it in part also is, the story that Taubes and others tell is such a incredible story, even at a journalistic level, the possibility that, so many scientists, well-intentioned, no doubt, but, got these questions about health and nutrition wrong. And, it's really, not necessarily, again, intentional, but one of the great scandals of our time, I think that, millions of people may have gone awry due to, science that wasn't conclusive. So, as a journalist, I felt it was an important story to tell and to understand. And, that's sort of what got me to the point of thinking about articles and books. And then, if you'd like, I can say more about why I turned to cancer in particular.
Yeah, that would be super interesting. I just want to reiterate, something you said about journalism. I think that is so important. I'm so glad you recognize that. People like Gary Taubes, Nina Teicholz, yourself, like they're not people that have necessarily the background in schooling, which again is really nice, but can steer you down the wrong path. They're just asking questions and shining the light on something that's been hidden, and they don't really have a dog in the fight, really. So they can uncover more of the truths and just tell the story, which I think is really, really awesome. We've been much needed. But yes, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about how you became more interested in cancer.
Yeah, so I was really interested in metabolism in the context of obesity and diabetes, but I had noticed that Taubes occasionally wrote about or mentioned cancer, and other people were starting to talk about cancer as a metabolic disease. So it's just so surprising to me, really, that cancer might be a part of this story as well. It just seemed more intuitive as a diabetes, obesity, even as cardiovascular story. But in my mind, cancer had always been, kind of a separate phenomenon where, you're dealing with mutations, bad luck, and sort of random genetic mutations. So I just thought it was a separate realm, and was really just intrigued by the metabolic component of cancer, and particularly intrigued by the epidemiological data, which shows that cancer had been relatively rare in the early 19th century, and then grew more common throughout the 19th century and 20th century, and really seemed to move in lockstep with the rise of obesity and diabetes. So I was very intrigued by all of that. But again, as a journalist and a storyteller by training, I always think in terms of how I'm going to tell a story, who the central character is going to be. And I discovered Otto Warburg, who made one of the key discoveries in terms of how cancer cells use energy. And that's when I really sort of fell in love with the story, because Warburg was such a fascinating character. And I realized I could tell the story by framing it around his life and research. And then it sort of all came together for me.
Wow, that's awesome. It's such a cool story because the science is already like baked into it. Like you can't divorce the two when you're telling the story. We'll get to know the science as well as we're kind of talking about it. But I would love to know who was Otto Warburg? Where did he come from? When did he come from? What was his story?
Sure. So Otto Warburg was a German scientist of Jewish descent. His father was a very well-known and well-respected physicist in Germany who worked with Einstein. And so Warburg grows up in the late 19th century around a lot of famous German scientists, Fritz Haber and Einstein and Emil Fischer, and sort of decides that he too is going to be a great scientist. And, eventually is looking, I think, is really just looking for what discovery he can make, which will change the world. And because Germany was growing obsessed with cancer, which was becoming much more common in the early 20th century, Warburg decided that he was going to make a great cancer discovery. He actually he's in fighting for Germany in World War I, and he receives a letter from Albert Einstein about people telling him to come home. So he comes home, and a few years later, he's studying how cells take up energy, and he makes this surprising discovery that, unlike other healthy cells, cancer cells don't seem to rely on their mitochondria, these power centers in the cell that use oxygen. Instead, the cancer cells were behaving a lot like simple microorganisms like yeast. They were just taking up a lot of glucose, the blood sugar that we all have, taking up that glucose and fermenting it, the same process that gives us beer and wine and bread. It was a really strange discovery, and, an important discovery that, for many years was at the center of cancer scientists. And then, as I talk about in Ravenous, over time, it sort of faded away before making a big comeback in the last few decades.
It's so interesting. Let me see if I have this right, if I understand this correctly. I'm not sure that I do. It's possible for human cells to use oxygen to produce energy, so oxidative phosphorylation, but it's also possible for the cell to ferment, but it's unusual that it doesn't when it is also in the presence of oxygen, because it should be using oxidative phosphorylation, excuse me. Is that the best way to say that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's always a little bit of this fermentation, this this glycolysis going on. But, usually a cell will not rely on it heavily in the way that cancer cells do. So what's unusual about cancer cells, and you do see this in other growing cells, and rapidly growing cells. But the unusual part is this heavy reliance on fermentation.
And that's an older form of energy generation, right? Like if we go back, a few billion years to the first creatures that appeared on our planet, they were using fermentation primarily and only later learned to use oxygen for energy production. Is that correct?
Well, that's an interesting question. And that's actually how Warburg thought about it and how I had thought about it when I started the book. But it's a little less clear than I thought. It's certainly an ancient form of metabolism, but it looks like oxidative phosphorylation or, using oxygen is much older than we thought. So I think it's inconclusive.
Interesting. So what happens in Germany, which we have to say too, at the time, to really understand this, at the time was really like ground zero of science, right? Didn't most science happen in Germany and not necessarily in the United States, where it kind of shifted after World War II?
German science, in the late 19th and early 20th century was really, at the pinnacle of the scientific world. They are dominating certainly the medical sciences and physics and a lot of different fields. And, all the leading scientific journals were in German. So, prior to the World War II, really, Germany had a really dominant position in the sciences.
So what other discoveries did he make along the way? And what was his story in Germany? That's a very difficult time to be German during, two major world wars.
Yeah. So, Warburg is at the top of the scientific world, really, in 1933 when the Nazis come to power. And he won the Nobel Prize in 1931. Not for his cancer research, surprisingly, although he deserved a Nobel Prize for that, but actually for his understanding of oxidative phosphorylation and respiration. He sort of discovered the key enzyme in the final stage, which makes it possible to use oxygen. And he gets a new institute that's built for him in 1931 by the Rockefeller Foundation. That alone really surprised me that an American foundation was building an institute for a German scientist not very long after World War I. Wow. So he's at the pinnacle of the scientific world. And then, Hitler comes to power in 1933. And, as a scientist of Jewish heritage, he's, suddenly persona non grata. He's no longer welcome in Germany, and many of his colleagues leave at that point. But Warburg decides to stay. He's an incredibly self-important man. That's one of the fascinating things about him. He's about the most arrogant scientist or human being I've ever read about. So he just, it just seems unfathomable to him that these Nazi lowlifes are going to tell him what to do and tell him to leave Germany. One of his famous lines was, "I was here before Hitler, how dare he tell me what to do?" So he stays put. And like many people, he thinks that the Nazis are going to be a short-lived phenomenon. And, he has offers from other places. He's torn, he goes back and forth, but he stays. And, the really amazing part is that, over time, it becomes clear that he's being protected only because the Nazis were extremely interested in cancer research. Hitler was personally fixated on cancer, and it turned out that a number of the other top Nazis were. So Warburg is saved in the end, despite his Jewish heritage, and is actually out of these hundreds of Jewish scientists who worked in these Kaiser Wilhelm institutes. Warburg is the only one to stay in his position to the very end of the war.
Wow. Did the two of them ever meet? I know it's kind of speculation, but what's your opinion on whether Warburg and Adolf Hitler met?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't believe they ever met. But one of the most fascinating things I found was that the day that Warburg was called into Nazi headquarters, and Hitler was in the building that day, and Himmler's notebook shows that he had a meeting about Warburg that day, and Warburg was basically called in, and it looked like it might be the end for him. He had been evicted from his institute, but that day he sits down with Victor Brack, another top Nazi, and is told that he's going to be allowed to live and continue working so long as he focuses on cancer. And then later that night, Goebbels' diary shows that he and Hitler are talking about cancer research, although it doesn't mention Warburg specifically. So it's pretty clear that Hitler was aware of the situation. But, the most extraordinary part of that whole thing, I didn't even realize this until I was like halfway through my book, is that the date that all this is going on is June 1st, 1941, which happens to be only hours before the launch of Operation Barbarossa, which is sort of the turning point in the war, the most significant moment in the war for the Nazis when they decide to go east into the Soviet Union. It was the biggest military invasion in history. So, it's just extraordinary to me that only hours before they were talking about Warburg. And, this is just a coincidence, I think, but I found out that it had originally been named Operation Otto, and they changed the name to Operation Barbarossa.
Wow. That's crazy. So that's how highly regarded he was, by the Nazis, that not only did he survive, but a day when other more important things were going on, they still, communicated with him, talked to him, pulled him in.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know if it shows it. What it reveals most of all is less about Warburg than how fixated they were on cancer. It's just incredible that at all these critical moments of the war, Hitler is talking about cancer research and looking into new theories, and it's really strange.
Do we know why?
Well, I mean, there are a number of reasons. I mean, one, he was crazy first and foremost, but and a hypochondriac. But the most significant influence was that Hitler was raised by his mother, and he lost his mother to breast cancer when he was a young man. And it was at a critical moment of his life when he was just sort of failing to become an artist as he had hoped to be. And it's really an extraordinary story that takes place in Austria, where he had grown up, and his mother is being cared for by a Jewish doctor. And Hitler seemed to actually like this doctor. He was the family doctor. And, day by day, they're by each other's side watching his mother fade away. And on Hitler's recommendation, the doctor uses an experimental, not his recommendation, but his encouragement, an experimental procedure, which causes his mother excruciating pain. And this Jewish doctor, Edward Bloch, actually later said that he had never seen a human more depressed than Hitler as he sat by his mother's side and watched her die. And, some historians say that Hitler's mother was the only the only human being he was ever capable of loving. So it clearly played a dramatic role in his psyche. And if you read Mein Kampf, he's constantly using cancer as a metaphor. And there's all sorts of weird things. He was obsessed with, like crayfish and shellfish that are called, you use the same word, Krebs, for these animals in German. So lots of strange things going on. But for whatever reason, he was really fixated on cancer.
Wow, that is incredible. The implications of that, Adolf Hitler's mother dying so early in life, it's really stunning. It must have been just thrilling to uncover some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, most of what, I didn't make, there's some things I'd like to think are original discoveries, but a lot of what I was doing, a lot of what journalists do is really connecting the dots, taking little bits of history that had been found elsewhere and sort of drawing connections between them. So, I think that, you talked about before about the role of journalists. I think, that's what we can do in the nutrition world as well, even if we come in as outsiders and aren't as well-versed in the science sometimes as the scientists themselves. But, when you're an outsider, you can see patterns in a way.
Yeah, that's amazing. So what was the rest of the war like for Otto? Did he have any other close calls, or was he able to continue his research?
Well, I sort of skipped over some period. He had a number of close calls along the way, partially because, as I mentioned, he was arrogant and reckless, and, the Nazi, brown shirts would come and knock on the door of his institute, and he would, chase them away and kick them out. So he really, he refused to give the Hitler salute or to put up the Nazi flag. So he really endangered himself. But after 1941, after that key moment on June 21st, he's protected, and they actually built a new institute for him in the countryside when bombs start to fall near his institute in Dahlem, Berlin. And they do this at a time, the Nazis do this at a time when, you couldn't even use gasoline unless you had government permission. So it's extraordinary that they put those resources in. So he makes it through the war. And Then after the war, both the Americans and the Russians are sort of interested in recruiting the top German scientists. But he eventually does come to America for a little while. But after the war, he was never quite the same scientist. I don't know if it was, the traumatic experience of what he went through, or he was getting older. But he was still a good scientist and still made some important discoveries, but he wasn't the extraordinary scientist he had been before the war.
And what happened to his original cancer research? It seems like it almost kind of disappeared for quite a big period of time.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was really mystified by and wanted to explore in the book, because it had been a fairly big deal. This major scientist makes this major cancer discovery, and it had launched this field of cancer metabolism research. And then after the war, it starts to fade away. And, by the 70s, it's essentially gone. And, then you have all these textbooks and papers coming out, which don't even mention Warburg or cancer metabolism. So one of the questions is why this happened. And, I don't know if there's a single answer which explains it. There are a lot of factors that contributed, one being Warburg himself making, really extreme statements that his discoveries, told you everything you needed to know about cancer and everything else was garbage. And he would say these things, in newspapers and before, conferences of Nobel laureates. So, he was his own worst enemy in some ways. But I think the single biggest factor was the arrival of, or the emergence of, cancer genetics in the aftermath of, Watson and Crick and Franklin discovering the structure of DNA. And then, in the 1970s, the identification of these first oncogenes, these, mutations that can drive cancer. So as that started to occur, people just lost interest in cancer metabolism. It started to seem like old world science, the kind of stuff that mattered decades before. They actually called these enzymes housekeeping enzymes. That sure, cancer needs energy, but it's not really the heart of the story. So it just disappeared, and it only started to come back in the late 1990s. But I was just amazed by, even in this famous paper called The Hallmark of Cancer, which comes out in 2000, which lists like the 6 key attributes of what cancer is or what it does. And it doesn't mention this, fundamental discovery Warburg had made about how cancer cells, take up glucose, even though, this occurs in 70% of cancers. And even though, at the time already, one of the key diagnostic tests was a PET scan, which works just by looking at where in the body extra glucose is being consumed, and that's where the cancer is.
Wow. So in your opinion, his original research wasn't suppressed on purpose. It was just kind of left behind as we were making new discoveries. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't use the word suppressed, but there was, to some extent, I don't know how large a role it played. I don't think this was the biggest role. I think, the biggest problem was the trendiness of, new trends in science and Warburg making extreme statements that he couldn't support. But I did, talk to scientists who admitted that, Warburg's reputation, affected their thinking. And some people suspected him of being a collaborator. And, even Qi Van Deng, this important scientist who was at Johns Hopkins at the time, started to rediscover some of Warburg's work. Somebody took him aside and said, be careful, you're getting into dangerous political territory by being pro-Warburg in some way. So there was some of that, but I don't think there was any sort of conscious effort to suppress it. I think it was just lack of interest.
Gotcha. So as we enter the 21st century, what was it that changed that people started finding his work again? Were they making the same discovery that he was making just 100 years later, or were they actually encountering some of his work from before?
Yeah, what happened is, Qi Van Deng, I mentioned, and there were a handful of others as well. These were people who were trained in the new world of oncogenes and the new molecular biology. So they were not interested in metabolism, but what they were interested in is understanding, how these oncogenes worked and what they did inside a cell when activated. And so they started to do this, and they started to trace these genetic signals inside a cancer cell. And what they found is that the key oncogenes actually seem to be controlling metabolism. So it was kind of a synthesis. And, as they looked at these enzymes that were being activated, it took them back to the early papers of Warburg and others. And, a lot of them didn't know how to study or work with enzymes. So they sort of had to go back to the basics. But it sort of came full circle. They're basically arrived back at Warburg because that's where their science led them.
So if Warburg's original theories prove to be true, what does that imply? What are the implications directly for cancer?
Sure. So I want to distinguish, I guess, between what Warburg's empirical findings and his theories, because the key thing that proved to be true, which he discovered, is that cancer cells take up glucose and ferment it in a way that other cells don't, and this seems to be very fundamental at the early stages of cancer. So that Warburg was correct about. But then there's also this theoretical question of why cancer cells do this. And Warburg's hypothesis was always that there had to be a dysfunction in the mitochondria in the way a cell uses oxygen, because a cell was not supposed to turn to fermentation unless it had to. That was the understanding at the time. So Warburg always thought there was a defect. And, that theory, some people still believe that, and it may be true in some cancers, but that theory hasn't held up as well. So what's really held up is just his fundamental discovery of what cancer cells do. And that, goes back to the question of, is there a therapy that, might be newly relevant because we understand that, or can we figure out if it's not a problem in the mitochondria or some sort of dysfunction and how we use oxygen, then what is, initially driving this shift to fermentation, this excess glucose? So, and Ravenous, my book, I'm most interested in this question of what's the origin of the story, what's driving this shift from fermentation. And that, took me into this whole world of diet and glucose and insulin, which, I'm happy to talk more about.
I would love to talk more about that. I would love to know your findings that you've come across as far as insulin goes and how that relates to cancer.
Sure. So, again, if the question is, what's turning on this Warburg metabolism, this aerobic glycolysis, if it's not a defect in the way that Warburg thought, then what is it? So, we had one interesting clue along the way, which is right at the same time that these scientists were sort of relearning Warburg science and discovering that these cancer-causing genes were controlling metabolism. A new study comes out which shows really conclusively the link between obesity and cancer. It had been suspected for a very long time, but the evidence was thought to be inconclusive. And then, you have this new evidence, which is overwhelming, and in the following years, more and more studies. So now we have an important clue that, something about the metabolism of our whole body and obesity seems to cause cancer, and something about the way the cancer cell eats and takes up glucose is very important. So what's interesting about this, coincidence that this is discovered at the same time is that both obesity and cancer have also, been shown to be driven by excess insulin, this hormone. And it makes perfect sense in the context of what Warburg discovered. If you think about what Warburg found fundamentally is that cancer cells are taking up much more glucose. Well, then you ask, how does a cell take up more glucose, or what allows a cell to take up glucose? And that's insulin's fundamental role in the body, tells the cell to take up glucose. So if a cell is hyper-responsive to insulin, as cancer cells seem to be, then excess insulin will give them a growth advantage, allow them to take up more insulin, to ferment it in the way that Warburg described, and to use that extra fuel to grow. And cancer cells tend to have more insulin receptors. The most common genetic mistakes or genetic mutations inside of cancer cells are actually in this pathway that responds to insulin. So when they get these mutations, they become hyper responsive to insulin. And one of the scientists I focus on the end of the book is named Luke Cantley, and he's really responsible for a lot of the understanding of what happens after insulin reaches its receptor on the cell, and it's really changed our understanding of cancer in profound ways. So from my perspective, a lot of people say that obesity causes cancer. I think the most compelling evidence is that this excess insulin drives both obesity and cancer. And certainly for all the inflammation caused, doesn't help things. But insulin, really looks like it may be just a really critical part of why cancer became such a common disease in the modern world.
I mean, that explanation makes the most sense to me when I think of insulin as promoting growth and cancer cells, growing to the point they end up killing the host and killing themselves. That makes a lot of sense to me, at least, that insulin is driving that. How well has this message been received in the scientific world?
Yeah, it's interesting, that you say that. It makes sense. Like if you were an alien coming down to Earth and you were thinking about, what would be suspect number one, well, certainly, a hormone which promotes, anabolic reactions and growth and which can function like a growth factor would be high on the list. So you could think it would be sort of on everybody's radar, but it's still not. I mean, it's changing and it's becoming more commonly understood, but it's still somewhat on the periphery. So, I don't fully understand why that is. I mean, a big part of it is that by the time, we were able to measure insulin in the body in the 1960s, cancer science had already been around for decades and people were already in sort of one frame of mind. And then when all the genetic stuff started, insulin didn't seem to be related to that. Insulin was a diabetes thing. So it just takes a generation, I think, for people to shift the perspective. But, I think it's starting to change, and Cantley and some others have certainly played a big role in that. But, the other problem, and this is, the troubling part, is that I do think that there's a bias against insulin precisely because it's related to diet, because we've seen with estrogen and other sex hormones that have been found linked to cancer. It doesn't seem as controversial, but for whatever reason, anything related to food immediately sort of smells of quackery to a lot of people in the scientific world. And I understand that because there is a lot of, quackery related to diet and food, and there has been over the centuries. But, that shouldn't change the fact that insulin is clearly responsive to diet and clearly plays a very important role in cancer. So, I hope that this trend will continue and people will continue to look at, this condition of hyperinsulinemia, higher insulin driving, I think many, not all cancers certainly, but many of the most deadly cancers.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Where there's smoke, there's fire. You mentioned Luke Cantley. We've been fortunate enough to speak with Dr. Thomas Seyfried. We've also been able to talk to Travis Christofferson. Both have talked about, cancer as a metabolic disease at length. And they're, especially Dr. Seyfried, the theory there is to starve the cancer of the fuel source, meaning consume less sugar, less carbohydrate. So there's less glucose in the body for the cancer to proliferate. And then, different methods of, finding ways to pause glutamine production. What do you think about like their ideas and as it relates to this type of research?
I think Seyfried deserves a lot of credit for, bringing cancer metabolism sort of back into the mainstream or somewhat near the mainstream. And Travis Christofferson has, I think, done a great job of promoting that work. And I know him and really admire him. So I think that, it's important work that they're doing, that Seyfried is doing, and I'm hopeful that something will come of it. It so happens that he is, in a way, more of a Warburg guy than I am, that he thinks Warburg is right, even theoretically, whereas I was, more focused on Warburg's experimental results than, this hypothesis that there is structural damage or an inability to respire. But it kind of gets into the weeds, that debate. I think the more important thing is that, they're thinking about cancer as a metabolic disease, which I think is important. I decided in Ravenous, I was thinking about in the last chapters of the book, going into something more like Seyfried's research and perhaps telling the narrative of some people who, there are these case studies or people who have done remarkably well on metabolic therapies, particularly for certain types of brain cancer. I decided not to do it in the end because we're still in such early days, and, the research, I'm optimistic that, these nutritional therapies, this targeted nutrition, which is really starting to catch on even among some mainstream cancer doctors, is going to make a big difference, probably as an adjuvant therapy, in conjunction with other therapies. But I think that there's such an incredible story to be told just about prevention that I decided not to go there as much in the end of the book, because I didn't want to, sort of have my story end with science that is still inconclusive, when there was this, really tremendous, centuries long worth of science, which pointed in the direction of how we might prevent more cancer.
Yeah, honestly, I think that's a wise decision. I think you do a great job telling the story without getting too much into the sticks or into the weeds, like you say. I'm curious, Travis told us about this as well. It's not only the idea of like limiting glucose in the diet and in the body, but also using ketones that your body makes endogenously inside the body. And you're making a fuel source that, number one, the cancer can't live on. And number two, all other cells seem to thrive on.
Yeah, no, I certainly don't think I know as much about it as Travis. And, it certainly makes sense to me that, these cancers, particularly these glioblastomas that thrive on glucose, that it would make perfect sense, to replace that fuel with ketones that they can't thrive on in the same way. And, cancers are, very good at adapting and finding new ways to fuel themselves. So it's not going to work as well with every cancer. But, I think there's a lot of promise there. And beyond that, I'm a big fan of the ketogenic diet because, it's first and foremost an insulin lowering diet, at least in my mind. So whether or not, the ketones themselves have special properties, maybe they do, maybe they don't. I think they probably do, but it's, still early stages. But if nothing else, if you're producing ketones, it means your insulin is low. So, that's a wonderful thing in itself.
Yeah, that's a huge benefit. As research on this continues, this is a problem we've dumped so much money into. Where do you think the money should go now? If you had a magic wand and could control, the funding, where would you put it?
I would.
I know it's tough for you to comment on it, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I would put it into research on insulin and this related hormone, insulin like growth factor 1 in cancer, in terms of therapy and the interplay of diet in those hormones. And I would put it, in the context of therapy, into targeted nutritional therapies. But I would put the bulk of the money probably into cancer prevention. And, I think a lot about smoking, and, one of the few success stories in cancer over the last, 50 years. We just had the 50th anniversary of America's, so-called war on cancer, and the reduction of lung cancer and the reduction of smoking is one of the only real success stories to tell from that 50-year period. So I would like to see a massive campaign raising awareness about diet and how it relates to insulin and obesity. And I think we could have similar success like we've had against lung cancer with a number of other cancers if people were aware of the insulin story, and particularly how sugar and maybe drinking sugar, worst of all, causes this, insulin resistance and elevated insulin. So that's where I would put the bulk of the focus.
I want to go back to your story. How you found all of this stuff. Tell us a little bit about how your life changed after you started to, read up, with Gary Taub, some of his books and start to learn about the ketogenic diet. I'm just curious, like what your life was like before and then after finding some of the things you were learning about.
Sure. So I, as you would probably guess, when you learn about these things, you're inclined to change your own diet. I started eating a lower carbohydrate diet a number of years ago. And, once I started researching Ravenous and started looking in particular at the role of sugar in driving insulin resistance, I became more strict about sugar. It certainly, personally made a big difference in my life in terms of being leaner and more energetic and just feeling healthier. A lot of people laugh or don't believe me when they say I was in bad shape because, I'm one of these people who is has a skinny build and had this condition of being, kind of what they call skinny fat. But I had elevated triglycerides and there's a lot of diabetes in my family. And I think it's actually precisely because we don't store fat easily, if you store fat subcutaneously under your skin, it can be a safe way to do it before insulin resistance arises when you get the fat around all your liver and your internal organs. So in my family, you go straight to diabetes.
Wow.
And you see this, in a lot of other kind of in India and China, you see this phenotype sometimes. So I certainly, feel much healthier. And, with obesity and diabetes, type 2 diabetes, I feel like you could control things. And cancer, there are some cancers that aren't related to obesity or insulin and are just bad luck. So there are no guarantees. I don't think I can save myself from cancer by doing this, but I think I can improve my odds. And, for somebody my age, cancer is the number one killer of adults in my age range. So I'm glad to be, doing the common sense things that I can. And, I enjoy following a low carbohydrate diet. It still seems amazing to me that people talk about it as restrictive. I know it can be hard to adjust to, but, at any other point in human history prior to the last century would have seemed like the most luxurious thing in the world to have all this meat and fat and eggs and cream.
Yeah, it's delicious. It's so good. So what does your diet look like today? What's a normal day of eating for you?
I eat a lot of eggs, and I usually try to have a late breakfast or even skip breakfast and then to have, eggs for lunch usually. And then, I drink a ton of coffee too. And then for dinner, I have a family and I'm not always super strict because I want to, have family meals together, but I try to avoid the carbs on the dinner table to the extent that I can. And I do, I'm not as strict as some people. And I have occasionally I drink diet sodas and I'll have some of these keto ice cream bars that I know the purists would frown upon, but it seems to be working for me. And I'm not convinced by the science, which suggests that diet soda is carcinogenic, or at the very least, it seems much less carcinogenic than actual sugar. So that's what I do. But I'm not. The way I like to think about it is, you want to get your insulin down. Some people need to do intermittent fasting. Some people are more insulin sensitive than others and don't need to be as strict. But, the goal should be to use whatever strategy works for you to get the insulin down.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's a great way to approach it. It's not too rigid or too strict. I think for a lot of people, they could have, a treat here and there and be totally fine. And that's one of the ways we coach people is, when you have a treat, really enjoy it. Make it something that you really like. And you might pay the price a little bit. You might not sleep that well. You might, feel weird the next day or have more anxiety, but really make it count and just do it on occasion versus, wasting it on just processed crap all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree.
So is it terribly difficult for you to maintain this, or do you figure you'll be eating this way for the rest of your life?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, it's not difficult for me because I've been doing it a while and I've adjusted to it. And, I know it's easy for me to say. A lot of people struggle with it. And, I've had some friends that I've really encouraged and they've sort of not been able to stick with it. So I know it's not easy, but I never, or at least for a long time, I haven't thought of it as a diet. I think of it as just, the way people are meant to eat. It's just what I do. So I don't think of it as like something I'm dieting or holding on to. It's just what I do. And, I could imagine myself changing things one day if new science arises that, convinces me that this is not the most healthy way. But for the time being, it seems very doable. I enjoy it. And, I think the science suggests that it is the best way to go. So I'm sticking with it.
Yeah, I agree. I would be really bummed out if the science said otherwise because I would lose out on a lot of delicious food.
Yeah, no, I mean, and there are occasional moments of doubt. I have, there's a lot of controversy around the LDL and all that stuff, but thus far, I think the science points heavily in the direction of this, low carb being the way to go.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, well, I love asking this question. If you were diagnosed with cancer today, based on everything you know at this point about cancer, what in your life would you change? It could be food, it could be any other lifestyle factor. What would you choose to do?
It's a tough one.
I know.
I think, the first thing I would probably do, well, I should say with, just for clarity that, the first thing I would do is go see a top oncologist and do probably whatever the standard protocol is for somebody in my situation. But, in addition to that, I would probably do a lot of research on whether some form of targeted nutritional therapy would be likely to help. The most obvious one would, of course, be to, do a, diet that's maybe even more extreme than something I'm currently doing in terms of restricting carbs or, looking at if I could target glutamine. But, there are these, new research which shows that, different types of cancer might respond to different nutrients. In fact, Cantley and Mukherjee just launched a new company just yesterday, actually, which is focused on giving cancer patients diets specific to their cancer. So I would certainly look at the particular type of cancer it was and how much evidence there was that one diet versus another might be relevant. But what I certainly would not do is just take matters into my own hands and just try to solve it with diet, because I don't think we're there yet. But, if I could enhance my odds on top of, chemotherapy or whatever else I might need, I would certainly look into that.
Yeah, I think there's so much value just in that. We've mentioned this already, but as an adjunct, with some of these other therapies, and guess what? If it doesn't, help chemotherapy, well, at least you're still being metabolically healthy. You know what I mean? Like you're going to get some benefit somewhere for sure. I'm curious. Are there any other lifestyle practices that you picked up during the research of this book that you believe will help keep you as cancer-free as you could possibly be, besides diet? We've talked a lot about diet. Is there anything else that you really got turned on to as you were researching this book?
Not really. I mean, I'm a believer in exercise, but insofar as, for as a means towards the same end of making oneself insulin sensitive. And so, I think exercise can be important, although, I do think that, I'm a believer in the idea that you can't outrun a bad diet. So I don't like to see it as a replacement for diet, but I do think it can be important. But no, not really beyond that.
Cool. I think if nothing else, that just shows you how powerful diet is in so many different ways, and how, you're right. You can't run a bad diet. It's just so critical for us to be eating well, to be feeling our best, and to let the human body do what it can do, which is absolutely amazing. Ravenous was such a big project. Is there anything you're working on for the future?
I am, interested in doing another nutrition related book, and I'm playing around with some ideas. I'm kind of interested in Stephenson, who was an Arctic explorer who was also one of the first people to sort of advocate for low carbohydrate diets in the 20th century, at least. So I may do something there, but I'm sort of taking a breather and focusing on my teaching these days.
Yeah, that's great. I'm sure you need a break after all of that. That would be an amazing story. He lived up north, around the Arctic, did he not?
He spent a lot of time there, and did a lot of polar expeditions. And, I realized, again, I was thinking in terms of, if I do another book, who is my central character? And he's a fascinating character. And I love the idea of being able to write about his polar expedition. It's fun, sort of journalistic adventure writing.
Yeah, that's amazing. That would be an awesome story, and would be awesome to hear it told by you. This has been an amazing conversation. If you had one simple tip you would like to leave with the listener today, what would that be?
I hate to, I feel like your listeners probably already know this, and nevertheless, the biggest takeaway from my book, I think, is, to eat less sugar. So I'll leave it at that.
That's great advice. We always think that's a really good idea. Sam Apple, where do you want people to go to find you, connect with you and your work?
They can go to my website, samapple.com. I'm also fairly active on Twitter. It's at Sam_Apple1. And that's about it, really.
That's great. We will link to that in the show notes. Sam Apple, author of Ravenous, Otto Warburg, The Nazis, and the Search for the Cancer Diet Connection. Thank you so very much for all of your research and for coming on our show today to teach us about this. We think this is so critically important, and we're so grateful for you and all the work that you've done, and for taking the time today to talk with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.